Okay. Hi, Vermont History students, and welcome to Unit 9 video for 2017. And this is the 5th week of the semester, and by the end of this week we will be up to about 1970, when the earth-shattering, land-breaking Act 250 Land Use Act is passed. And so we need to sort of get from the Great Depression, the late 1920s, to 1970 by the end of the week. And then we'll really know that the course is coming to its rapid conclusion. As far as housekeeping goes, this is Monday morning. I'm going to go and check the town meetings by about 1 o'clock today and see how people have voted on the documents. And also I have a whole bunch of grading to do today. A whole bunch of papers have come in over the weekend, and I think most people are on schedule to finish up just fine, but do be aware that I need 3 papers by next Friday. I have to enter my grades on Friday, June 30th. So be ready to be done by then, please, and don't worry about it, deadlines so much as worry about giving me really nice, intelligent papers that you really want to write about a era, and over those 50 or so years, did Vermont grow more united or divided? Give me a beginning point and an end point. Okay, so this is Unit 9, and it is primarily about a person whose name is George Aiken, who was governor from 1937 to 1941, and then he went into the United States Senate and was there for a very long time. And he's both practically and also symbolically a model of how Vermont had to adjust and adapt in the 1930s into the 1940s to the new realities of its economy and its society. And very soon what's going to happen after that is the interstate highways are going to get built, which is the most important thing to happen to Vermont in the 20th century. We enter into the interstate age in Unit 10. And Aiken sort of helped Vermont adjust to that process. It prepared it for it. He revitalized Vermont tradition, but also gave it a language and a way to adjust to change without sacrificing the things that were best about Vermont. And Aiken came along at a very important time, the Great Depression. And Vermont at that point was in crisis. There's an old saying that Vermonters were so poor on the whole that they didn't notice the Depression, but it's not true. The beginning, a really big landmark in the change that was to come was the flood of 1927. And the flood of 27 was a massive flood that damaged the state enormously. Vermont had traditionally been a pay-as-you-go kind of state. It had never run deficits and never accepted much federal help. But in order to cope with the devastation of the flood of 1927, it took a couple $1,000,000 from the federal government. And so that's sort of like symbolically important, to say the least, but the change that the flood really opened people's eyes to, the fact that Vermont really was not doing very well, was a much longer term process. The most important industry in the state, dairy farming, was on the decline. During the Depression, actually, the number of people living on farms went up, because there's plenty of work on farms, and there's plenty to eat. But the high point for the number of farms in Vermont was actually the census of 1880, when rural Vermont theoretically was in decline. But anyway, that was the high point, about 35,000 farms, and it goes down from there. By the time you get to the 1920s, it's under 30,000. And so dairy farming was in decline for a host of reasons, competition, and the technology was becoming more complex and expensive. In addition to that, the other important parts of the Vermont economy were also in decline. The traditional economy, that is to say, textiles, various kinds of manufacturing, paper making, textiles, those were in decline. Extractive industries, marble and granite and slate, and very importantly, lumber, the timber industry had been enormously important in Vermont. Those were all in decline by this point. So Vermont's old economy is sort of going away by the time you get to the early 1930s, even before the Great Depression. And then, of course, the Great Depression kills many of them enormously. And Vermont falls into this period of great chaos, of disorder in the early 1930s. There's a lot of ways that is true. One thing that they found in the early 30s was that the one depression-proof industry was tourism. The number of people who came to Vermont as tourists actually increased in the early 30s. And the Bureau of Publicity had a big program calling Vermont the unspoiled Vermont, Vermont was unspoiled was the slogan, which couldn't be further from the truth if you look at its environment, for instance. And also, it was not, devoid of the problems that other places faced. And one model for that is the Rutland Marble Strike of 1935-36. And so I have a bunch of material on that. It was a nasty strike. The Vermont Marble Company was owned by the Proctor family, a very powerful Vermont family, politically. The workers were mostly people of Catholic ethnic background, many of them Eastern European or Italian or Irish, many of whom had lived in the state for, at this point, 2 or 3 generations. But the question was still up in the air, were they Vermonters? And a lot of the strike, which began in the fall of 1935, when the company cut wages, revolved around, are they entitled to all the benefits and privileges that Vermonter status lends them? Are they really Vermonters? Are they not Vermonters? And the strike attracted a lot of outside attention because it was such a nasty strike with bombings and violence at the company gates. Attracted all this attention because it was Vermont, and Vermont had sold itself as being this state devoid of modern problems. And the Rutland area had a lot of wealthy, well-to-do and highly educated people who had summer homes there. Sinclair Lewis, Dorothy Thompson, all these writers. And so they covered this strike very closely. And eventually it ended in June of 1936 with the complete defeat of the workers, after the state had hired armed guards and sent the National Guard down there to keep the gates of the factory open. Really nasty business. And it's right in that year, in the fall of 36, after the strike had ended, that George Aiken was elected governor. And Aiken was a guy who walked the line between uphill and downhill beautifully. He was a farmer, a dairy farmer. He lived on a dairy farm in Putney, but he'd started a seed business with wildflowers because he loved wildflowers, collected the seeds, and then started a mail-order seed business. So he was both a farmer and a businessman. And he had a meteoric rise through state politics because of this sort of void, this vacuum of power that the Depression caused. And when he got elected governor in 36, he took over in 37, one of the first things he did was give a speech at a American Federation of Labor banquet, at a union banquet, which is something Vermont governors had never done before. And he went before them and he said, the state is as much yours as it is anyone else's, you're as much Vermonters as anyone else. And this was really groundbreaking. This was really novel. And then when there were strikes while he was governor, he used to settle them peacefully. He would call representatives of labor and management into his office and say, we're not leaving until this gets done. And then they would finally sign an agreement, and he would come out and plausibly say, we have solved this strike without any government interference. You know, particularly would point to the strike of 35-36, the marble strike, as the opposite of what he had done. We didn't have to call in and spend $50,000 on armed guards and things like that. He also built a working partnership between agriculture institutions, and he was very popular among farmers, Aiken was, between the Vermont Farm Bureau, the Extension Service, and between the American Federation of Labor, and particularly with the most important union in Vermont was the Granite Quarriers Union in Barre. And he said all the time, we need a working partnership between agriculture and labor. We need to realize that unions are just like farmers' cooperatives. People organize together in order to get things done and improve their situation. And he really expanded the language of who was a Vermonter by calling everyone Vermonters who lived in the state. And he also made Vermont tradition, as Vermont was adjusting to its new realities, more vital than ever, because he kept talking about, we solved this in a Vermont way. We solved it through cooperation. We solved it through togetherness. We solved it through neighborliness. And so he's an extraordinarily decisive turning point kind of figure, George Aiken was. At the end of his term, World War II started, and of course World War II had an enormous impact on Vermont in a variety of ways. And after World War II, it would really be very crass and ugly to call people of French Canadian heritage or Irish heritage not Vermonters. And then Aiken went off to the Senate, where he got things done, and Vermont continued to have things like the Vermont Industrial Relations Council, which said that we mediate strikes in a very Vermont way. People sit across a table together and solve their problems diplomatically and peacefully because we all belong in this state together. And all the while, the state still had terrible roads. It was still a very poor state. It had lowest education levels in all of New England, it had the highest infant mortality level, and it had terrible roads, and it was still this rural, isolated backwater. But if you were to build highways that put Vermont within a day's driving distance of some 80 million people, the state would change enormously. The roads would be improved, and people would have an expectation about what Vermont was going to look like. And increasingly during the Depression, Vermont had been impacted by federal programs and by the need for regulation. There was a planning board which had done a survey of the state in the mid-1930s. Skiing was beginning to take off, with Bromley and Mount Mansfield being developed for skiing by the late 1930s. The first ski tow was in Woodstock, and then a lift was put in at Mad River Glen. And increasingly, Vermont is going to be threatened by development and the challenges of development, which has the potential to destroy the rural, scenic look for which it's known. That's its greatest asset. And so there's going to be a really huge need to regulate Vermont. And if you had unregulated development, then Vermont might turn into, like everywhere else, it would end up looking like New Jersey. And obviously, I mean, you would think uphillers don't want that. They like tradition. But they also need jobs because the old traditional economy is in decline. So is regulation like the best thing that could happen to uphillers? Do they need regulation, an enormous amount of zoning and laws related to managing development, because that way you can keep the state traditional? Or is zoning and regulation the worst thing that could happen to them, because they'll basically be zoned out of the state, and the state will be organized around the interests of people unlike them? So that's the question for this unit. Regulation and zoning are already starting, and they're going to increase. And that's going to keep Vermont at least looking traditional. And Vermont's not going to go in the direction of becoming urban, suburban, strip mall-y, except for Burlington, like other places. But is that the best thing that could happen to uphillers, or is it the worst thing that could happen to uphillers if there's an enormous amount of regulation, of development, and of the scenery, and of the environment? That's the question I'm posing to you for this discussion, and I'm looking forward to Wednesday's answers to that question. And hopefully everything is going well, and please write me if you have any problems. And hello to Jason Isaacs. And I guess that's about it with my electric 12-string. It's a very nice guitar. And I'll put this down, and I'll turn you off, and that should do it.